Hello, friends. My name is Muhammad Said, and today I want to open my heart in a way I've never done before. This isn't easy for me. I spent years struggling internally, in silence, wondering if I would ever have the courage to tell all of this. I'm not here to impress, convince, or attack anyone. I'm simply here to share my story, a story that has cost me sleepless nights, hidden tears, and many moments of profound confusion. What I'm about to share may seem difficult to hear and perhaps even disconcerting, but it's real. It's my journey. It's my truth. For a long time, I lived with a silent question hammering inside me. What if everything I learned as God's will was actually taking me away from Him? What if, without realizing it, my pursuit of holiness and obedience was leading me down a path completely opposite to what I'd imagined? I know it may seem extreme, even absurd, but this was the reality I had to face. A harsh truth, one I never would have accepted years ago, but God, in His mercy, began to open my eyes in ways I never could have imagined. For years, I was very devout. My prayers were constant, my fasts were rigorous, and I studied fervently. I wanted to please God with all my heart, but over time, something inside me began to wear thin. It wasn't physical exhaustion, it was something deeper, more existential. The feeling that, no matter how well I did everything, something essential was missing. It was like trying to touch the sky and never quite getting off the ground. The harder I tried, the more trapped I felt. I began to wonder, am I truly knowing God or just following a system? If you've come this far seeking answers, or perhaps simply driven by curiosity, I invite you to continue. I don't promise to convince you of anything, but I promise to be honest. My story will challenge concepts, shake up deeply held ideas, and perhaps even shake the foundations of what you've always believed. But I truly hope that by listening to my testimony, you realize you're not alone in your pain, your doubts, or your thirst for something real. Because there is hope, even when everything around us seems to push us toward despair. I know this is a sensitive topic, extremely sensitive. When we talk about faith, we're not just talking about beliefs or practices. We're talking about identity, about deep roots that form in childhood and shape who we become. For many, faith is the foundation of life, the way they see the world, themselves, and even what they consider right or wrong. Therefore, I want to make something very clear from the outset. What I'm about to share is not a criticism of Islam, nor of anyone who professes a faith different from mine. It's not meant to offend or cause controversy. It's simply about sharing my experience, honestly, respectfully, and with the hope that it might help someone. For a long time, I myself would feel offended if I heard someone question my religion. I thought it was disrespectful, ignorant, or even a spiritual attack. But today, after everything I've been through, I've learned that sometimes sincere questioning is precisely the first step toward the truth. For years, I kept quiet. I felt a growing discomfort within me, an uneasiness that couldn't be easily explained, but I repressed it because questioning was dangerous. I was afraid of what my family would say, what my friends would think. I was afraid of losing myself, of being rejected, of finding myself completely alone, and this fear paralyzed. But you know what I discovered? That silence can be a prison, a cruel prison, where you convince yourself you're safe, when in fact, you're being suffocated. When you can't ask questions, when you can't have doubts, when everything must be accepted without reflection, then you're no longer in a relationship with God. You're just following a closed system. And that's what I began to realize, that the faith I'd been taught since childhood was sacred, yes, but also full of human rules and expectations that didn't always reflect God's heart. That's why I speak today, because silence is no longer an option. Because there are thousands, perhaps millions of people experiencing what I experienced, feeling trapped, confused, afraid to admit something is wrong. If you're one of these people, know that there is a way out, and it begins with the truth. Not with the truth of a man, but with the truth that comes from God, revealed with love, grace, and freedom. And that's what I want to share with you on this journey. Not arguments, not religions, but the path that led me to know a God who doesn't want me to live in fear, but rather with a full life. Before I continue, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. Listen. Just listen. You may not agree with what I'm about to say, and that's okay. I'm not expecting applause or approval. All I ask is that you listen, because it's through honest listening that understanding is born. And it's through understanding that we begin to see others with more humanity. I'm not here to impose truths, nor to try to change anyone. I'm here because I finally understand that my story can serve a purpose greater than just easing my own pain. If you'd like to leave a comment, feel free. I just ask that you be respectful. Disagreeing is a natural part of the process, but respect is essential because this space isn't for arguments or insults. It's for those who, even with doubts and confusion, are sincerely searching for something real. A space where difficult conversations can happen without fear. And if you're here, listening to me so far, know that your presence already means a lot to me. You can't imagine how much. Let's start at the beginning. I was raised in a very devoted Muslim family. I'm not talking about a superficial faith. I'm talking about a home where religion was everything. It was the center of life, the guiding light for our decisions, the rhythm of our daily lives. I remember mornings when the sound of the adhan, the call to prayer, echoed through the walls of the house before sunrise. It was like a sacred bell that awakened us, reminding us that life was not about us, but about serving God. I remember the smell of incense wafting from the mosque on the corner, how that aroma permeated my clothes and my memory. It was an atmosphere charged with reverence, but also with intensity. My parents took their faith very serious. 5 times a day, they would stop everything they were doing to kneel on their prayer mat. There was a sense of discipline, of sacrifice, of surrender. And as a child, I thought this was what everyone did. I believed this was the only right way to live, that anything different was wrong, dangerous, perhaps even cursed. I grew up with this mindset. Faith wasn't a choice. It was a sacred obligation. It was present in every meal, in every greeting, in every thought. It was like the air we breathed. But as solid and reverent as all this seemed, there were questions that couldn't be asked, doubts that needed to be stifled. And, as time passed, this began to eat away at me. But that part, I'll tell you in the next chapter. Because what comes next is where everything begins to change. In my childhood, everything around me revolved around obedience. Not just obedience to parents or school, but to a rigid, detailed, and profound religious structure. From an early age, I learned that there were things you simply couldn't do. Pork, for example, was more than a forbidden food. It was a symbol of impurity, almost like a red line that, if crossed, would bring severe spiritual consequences. Alcoholic beverages, they were treated with the same level of revulsion. And even the way animals were slaughtered had to follow specific rituals, because if it wasn't halal, it was impure, offensive to God. This wasn't just tradition. It was sacred. It was law. It was the way to please Allah. At least, that's what I believed with all my heart. I didn't feel forced, not at that stage. As a child, all of this made sense because it was the only reality I knew. It was like breathing, automatic, natural. I had no other references. I remember fondly, and with a certain longing, my father sitting with me on the living room floor, ever patient, while I repeated Surah Al-Ikhlas behind him. That moment became a defining memory, not because I understood the full theological depth of what I was reciting, but because I felt I was doing something right. Say, He is Allah, the One, he would repeat, and I would try to imitate his intonation exactly. It was simple, almost poetic. It touched me, even without knowing why. Over time, memorizing verses of the Quran became part of my routine. By the age of 10, I could already recite entire surahs by heart, something that filled my family with pride. Surah Al-Baqarah 2.163 was one of the most impactful to my young mind. And your God is one God. There is no deity but He. It was more than a declaration of faith. It was the essence of everything I knew about spirituality. I deeply believed that following these words would lead me to paradise, Jannah. For me, Islam was not just one religion among many. It was the only truth, and any deviation was apostasy, punishment, and condemnation. But life isn't just about doctrines. It's about questions, experiences, conflicts. And as I grew older, these questions began knocking on the door of my heart with more force than I'd like to admit. Adolescence arrived like an unexpected wave. I, who was so secure in everything, began to feel divided. On the one hand, I loved the rituals, the sense of purpose, the beauty of sacred words. On the other, I began to notice cracks in the structure. Cracks that didn't come from outside. They came from within. They appeared in small things, like when I missed a prayer because I was playing, or when I questioned why I couldn't listen to music like my classmates. At first, they were fleeting discomfort, but they soon evolved into larger, deeper questions. Why does Allah, who is described as merciful, demand obedience so rigidly? Why are the punishments for those who err, even through ignorance, so severe? Why aren't women given equal space in mosques? Why aren't men allowed to lead prayers? And what about the laws that seem so far removed from the reality of the modern world? Why is doubt treated as treason? I tried to hide these thoughts. I thought it was just a phase, that I needed to pray more, fast more, study more. But the more I tried to suppress these doubts, the more they grew. And the most painful thing was knowing that, in my home, as in many others within the Muslim community, questioning was dangerous. Doubt was not seen as a step toward truth. It was considered rebellion against Allah, and there was no room for rebels. This internal conflict intensified. My eyes began to see things I hadn't noticed before. Traditions that seemed to lose their meaning. Rules that became mere repetitions, lifeless, disconnected from the heart. At night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I would lie staring at the ceiling, my heart aching. I once read Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:32, which says that saving one life is like saving all of humanity. It moved me. It was beautiful, profound, a clear message of compassion. But then I remembered other passages that spoke of eternal punishment, the fate of unbelievers, the hell reserved for those who strayed from the path, and confusion gripped me. How could these two extremes coexist in a single holy book? Faith, which had once been my refuge, began to feel like a prison. Not because I no longer believed, I still did. I clung to it with all my strength, because abandoning it meant losing everything. My family, my community, my sense of belonging. But deep inside me, something was already broken. I found myself faced with an impossible dilemma, maintaining the appearance of devotion, even as my heart began to cry out for something more, something real. And it was in that silent cry that God began to find me, but not in the way I expected. And that part comes later. For a long time, I tried to ignore what I was feeling. I preferred to convince myself that my questions arose from my own ignorance, from my lack of spiritual maturity. I thought, perhaps I am not yet ready to understand the mysteries of faith. Maybe it was a phase, something passing. After all, who was I to question what millions of people had followed so zealously for centuries? So I did what many do when they feel the discomfort of doubt. I swept it all under the rug of religiosity. I kept obeying. I kept praying. I kept telling myself that, in time, it would pass. But it didn't pass. On the contrary, the seeds of doubt that were once silent, discreet, began to grow. And they grew so large that they could no longer be ignored. Looking back today, I see that my religious upbringing was like a tree with strong roots. On the one hand, it cultivated in me a deep sense of devotion, discipline, and reverence. But on the other hand, unintentionally, it also cultivated a fear of questioning, of thinking for myself, of listening to the voice that God placed within me from the beginning. A voice that said, there is something more, something beyond blind obedience, something beyond rules and rituals. During my childhood and adolescence, I saw Islam as the only truth. Anything outside of it was error. There was no room for nuance, no alternatives. It was black and white. But as I matured, reaching my late teens and early 20s, the questions that had once been whispered began to scream. It was as if still water had begun to bubble, bringing to the surface everything I had tried to ignore for so long. At first, the doubts seemed small. almost trivial things. I said to myself, just pray more, study more, fast more fervently, but it didn't work. The more I tried to drown my doubts in rituals, the more they resurfaced. Now, more intense, deeper, more impossible to suppress. One of the first questions that truly troubled me was, if Allah is indeed omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, why does he need intermediaries? If God can do everything, sees everything, is everywhere, why then would he need prophets to convey his message? Why not speak directly to us, as a father speaks to his children? The faith I was taught asserted that Allah is unreachable, too mysterious, and that only through the prophet could we know what he wanted of us. But this idea began to seem contradictory to me. Because a truly all-powerful God should have no difficulty revealing himself to each human being individually, a loving God would not want to hide behind ancient messages, but would show himself present, personal, and close. Another question arose when I began to pay closer attention to how Islam treated women. For a long time, I accepted what I had been taught, that men were the leaders, the providers, the guardians, and that women should occupy a more demure, submissive, reserved role. That was how life worked. But over time, and especially as I began to have more contact with people outside my community, I began to see how much this limited, hurt, and made invisible the incredible women around me, my sisters, cousins, friends, so often suffocated in the name of honor, zeal, or God's will. Seat. How could we justify women being required to cover themselves completely, while men weren't required to? How could we reconcile Surah An-Nisa 4:34, which says that men are the guardians of women, with the idea that all human beings are equally worthy? That verse, which once seemed to me merely a cultural instruction, began to bother me deeply, because it wasn't just about men and women, it was about power. It was about a hierarchy legitimized by God. And deep inside my heart, something said, this is not right. These questions weren't mere theological debates for me. They were real. They had faces. They had names. They were pains experienced by people I loved. And the more I read the Quran, not just as a follower, but as someone seeking sincere answer, the more the contradictions seemed to leap from the pages. At one point, I would read something profoundly moving, like Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:32. Whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved all of humanity. And I thought, this is beautiful, this is fair, this is divine. But soon after, I came across passages that spoke of eternal punishment, severe condemnation, and the destruction of those who doubt or reject. And that confused me. Because the same God who teaches that saving a soul is a sacred act is also described as the one who will cast people into eternal fire, including for doubt, for not following the precepts correctly. How did that make sense? These weren't questions of rebellion. They were sincere cries for clarity, for justice, for truth. I still wanted to believe. I still wanted to trust. But my soul was beginning to realize that God could not be contradictory, that love cannot go hand in hand with fear, that the creator of all that is good could not hide behind human, patriarchal, and unjust structures. And it was at this point that my journey began to transform, because, without realizing it, God was already leading me, not away from faith, but closer to truth. I remember exactly the moment I began to realize that my doubts were no longer just isolated thoughts. They were like echoes repeating themselves within me, growing in volume and weight. Sometimes, just turning a few pages of the Quran would send me on an emotional roller coaster. There were moments of beauty and compassion, like verses about mercy, generosity, and justice. But soon after, I'd come across passages that described in detail the eternal suffering in store for those who simply didn't share my beliefs. I asked myself, how can a God who describes himself as compassionate and merciful condemn a soul to eternal fire just for being born into a different belief system? This question wouldn't leave my mind. I knew that millions of people around the world were born into different religions, educated from an early age to follow specific doctrines and practices. How fair, then, should they be judged for something they never consciously chose? This apparent contradiction gnawed at me. If God is just, Shouldn't he judge people based on their intentions, their hearts, and not their circumstances of birth? And if he is loving, why the constant emphasis on punishment, condemnation, and fear? It was as if there were two different voices speaking in the scripture, one calling for love and kindness, the other shouting threats of fire and torment. And it disoriented me profoundly. The more I read, the more I felt trapped between these tensions. One verse that particularly bothered me was Surah An-Nisa 4:34. The passage stated that men are responsible for women, and in certain cases, they could even use violence as a form of discipline. This shocked me. I was a young man trying to understand what was morally right, and here was a text that, regardless of its historical context, was still being recited and followed as the eternal word of God. How could this come from a God who is love? Even though scholars endlessly debate the context and application of this verse, the mere fact that such language existed made me question everything. It didn't seem like a reflection of divine love. It seemed shaped by an ancient, patriarchal culture trying to justify its control over women with God's authority. And no matter how much they tried to convince me otherwise, something inside me screamed, "This isn't right. This isn't fair. This doesn't seem to come from a good God." At that stage of my life, I wasn't fighting against God. Quite the opposite. I was desperately trying to find Him. I wanted to understand. I wanted to trust. I wanted to be sure that He was, in fact, who I'd been taught He was. But what I saw wasn't clarity, it was contradiction. And this left me not only confused, but also anguished. There were days when I felt completely paralyzed by guilt, afraid that I was sinning just by questioning, afraid that my thoughts were opening a door for Satan to lead me away from salvation. I remembered the sermons that said the devil planted doubts in the hearts of believers, and then I felt guilty, dirty, unworthy. I began to shut myself out. I kept everything to myself. I didn't dare share these questions with anyone, not even my closest friends, not even my family. The fear of being judged, of being excluded, of being accused of blasphemy was too great. I no longer slept peacefully. It was as if I lived a constant internal battle between the fear of condemnation and the insatiable thirst for real answers. It was then that, in silence, I began searching. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, I would turn on my computer and dive into research. I would search for terms like, is Allah the same as God? Is there salvation outside of Islam? Why do Muslims believe in eternal punishment? I was hungry for truth, for meaning, for liberation, and without even realizing, this was the moment my soul began to take its first steps out of the prison of fear and enter a new territory, that of true quest. It was through the internet that I gained access to ideas never presented to me at the mosque. I began studying other religions and philosophy. I read about Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, even Zoroastrianism. And, to my surprise, I found commonalities with Islam, but also stark differences. Some of these doctrines resonated with me in a way that the traditions I grew up listening to never had. But no idea touched me as deeply as the Christian concept of grace. The simple yet powerful notion that salvation comes not from a human effort to obey perfect rules, but from an unconditional love poured out upon us, even in our failing. It left me speechless. Grace, as presented in Jesus' teachings, was something I had never experienced. Forgiveness that doesn't need to be earned. Acceptance that comes before transformation. Faith that is born of relationship, not imposition. For the first time, I felt hope amidst the chaos. A hope that didn't tell me you have to be perfect to be accepted, but rather, you are accepted, and therefore you can begin to be transformed. The idea of a God who draws near to man, who becomes flesh, who suffers with the pain of humanity, this was something radically different from anything I had ever known. And in that early morning silence, with my eyes fixed on the screen, I realized something inside me had changed forever. I still didn't know where all this would lead me, but I knew there was no going back to the darkness of obedience without understanding. Now, I needed to follow the light, however small it was, that was beginning to appear on my horizon. There was something strangely comforting about Buddhist teaching. The way they spoke about the mind, self-awareness, detachment from suffering, all of it brought a quiet peace I no longer found in the prayers I recited mechanically 5 times a day. There was clarity in that simplicity. Buddhist principles seemed so direct, so human, so free from the constant fear of punishment that haunted every choice in my old faith. But with each line of a new text I read, there also came a sense of betrayal, as if I were breaking a sacred vow to Allah, even if that vow had never truly been mine, but rather inherited. I began to live divided between 2 worlds. On one side, intellectual freedom, the pleasure of discovery, of thinking, of comparing, of reflecting honestly. On the other, the weight of spiritual loyalty, the paralyzing guilt that told me I was sliding toward damnation, that I was being deceived by foreign and dangerous ideas. It was an invisible war within me, and with each new reading, each new question, this war intensified. It wasn't just about ideas, it was about my identity. Abandoning Islam, or even questioning it, was like trying to amputate a part of myself. It was all I knew. It was intertwined with how my family viewed me, the respect I received from the community, the role I played in so many people's lives. I knew that any step out of line could mean rejection, loneliness, dishonor, and yet, I felt I couldn't continue living in that internal prison. Something had to give. I was teetering between hope and despair, certainty and confusion, faith and fear. It was like walking on a bridge of cracked glass. Each step took me further away from what I once considered sacred, but also brought me closer to something I barely understood, but that felt genuine. The search for a God I didn't yet know, but for whom my heart was beginning to yearn almost painfully. Looking back now, I realize that wasn't just a period of doubt. It was the beginning of my liberation. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to think freely. For the first time, I had the courage to confront what I'd always been told was indisputable. And that was both terrifying and invigorating. I felt fear, yes, but I felt something even stronger. Thirst. An insatiable thirst for truth. And then it happened. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't a prophetic dream or a supernatural experience. It was a random night, alone in my room. I had the Quran in my hands, as I had so many times before. But this time, it wasn't to memorize or recite. I simply wanted to understand, to read with clear eyes, to see with an open heart. And something changed. I remember turning a page and stopping. I don't remember exactly which verse it was. What struck me wasn't the specific text, but the overwhelming feeling that something inside me had finally broken, or maybe freed itself. The doubts that had once seemed like threats to my faith now shone like lights, revealing cracks I'd never wanted to see. What I'd once been told was true worship, I could no longer recognize as coming from God. It was too heavy, too dark, too controlling. It was there that I noticed something unsettling, something that still gives me chills to this day. Many of the practices I had considered spiritual might not be bringing me closer to God. Maybe they were actually moving me further away from Him. I began to see how much the faith system I had grown up in relied on intermediary, prophet, saints, ancestors, and even unseen beings like the jinn to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. This had never bothered me before. It was just part of the tradition, part of the way things were done. But now, in my moment of greatest vulnerability, this dependence struck me as deeply troubling. I remembered the times my family would travel to visit the tombs of sages or martyrs considered men of God. I remembered the prayers said before graves, the burning of incense, the promises left as offerings in exchange for cures, miracles, or blessing. At the time, it all seemed beautiful. It was reverence, it was devotion. But now, it reminded me of practices that the Quran itself seemed to condemn. Surah Al-An'am, for example, spoke clearly about the sin of associating partners with Allah. Shirk, that was the term, the most serious of all sins, the only one that, according to doctrine, cannot be forgiven. How then could this coexist with the faith we were taught? How could these practices be part of devotion if the Holy Book itself warned against them? The realization hit me hard. It was as if I were caught in a subtle trap, a form of veiled idolatry disguised as piety. And then, for the first time, I asked myself, was I worshiping God or just obeying a religious system built by men? That question turned me inside out. It shook me inside, but it also set me free, because in that moment, I knew clearly, if God truly is who He says He is, holy, loving, just, accessible, then He needs no intermediary. He demands no fear, only truth. And He certainly doesn't hide behind rules that distance Himself from His children. It was there, on that silent night, that something began to be born, something small, but real, a new hunger, a new hope. I didn't know its name yet, but now I do. It was the beginning of an encounter, not with a new religion, but with God Himself. The more I reflected on all I had learned, the more restlessness arose within me. It was as if God were peeling back, layer by layer, the veil that had been covering my eyes for years. I thought I was worshiping the one true God, but I began to realize that, in practice, I was placing many barriers between myself and Him. Revered figures, ritualistic traditions, nearly untouchable religious leaders, and, above all, a system that demanded absolute submission but discouraged sincere questioning. I began to see the harsh reality. Although Islam openly condemned idolatry, or shirk, like the unforgivable sin, many of the rituals we practiced were not so different from what the Quran and the Bible themselves condemn. It was an uncomfortable contradiction. The truth is, we were doing exactly what Islam said it condemned in other people, establishing intermediaries between ourselves and the Creator. It was then that I came across a passage of the Bible that cut me to the core. Isaiah 44, 9-20. I'll never forget how that text struck me. The prophet exposes with devastating clarity the absurdity of idolatry, describing men who carve images with their own hands, bow down before them, and say, "You are my God." The passage ridicules this behavior as foolish and empty. And there, in that scathing critique, I saw myself. I saw my practices. I saw the blindness with which I had been raised. I began to ask myself, were we truly worshiping the true God? Or had we fallen into the very trap the prophets had always warned against? The thought sent a chill down my spine. The thought that the prayers I'd said for so many years, so full of hope, tears, and cries, could have been addressed not to the Creator of the universe, but to a religious structure tainted by practices inherited from paganism, was almost unbearable. And, to make matters worse, this realization took on an even more intense dimension when I had a dream that left a profound impression on me. In Islam, dreams are treated seriously. Many believe they are messages from Allah or revelations from the unseen world. I grew up hearing stories of people who saw angels, heard voices, and received spiritual guidance in dreams. And until that moment, I had never experienced anything like it. But that night, I did. In the dream, I was in a vast desert. The ground was dry and cracked. The sky tinged a deep red that seemed to pulse with something menacing. Before me, two paths opened. One glowed with a soft, serene, almost magnetic golden light. The other was shrouded in a thick, dark mist, where distorted shadows whispered words I couldn't understand, but which filled me with inexplicable fear. Amidst the silence, a voice, firm, yet full of mercy, echoed within me. "Choose wisely, for your eternal destiny depends on it." I woke in a panic. My body was drenched in sweat. My heartbeat seemed deafening in the silent dawn, and even after washing my face, trying to go back to sleep, the image wouldn't leave me. That voice, that desert, those two paths, it was as if a message had been burned into my soul. For days, I couldn't shake the impact. Something inside me told me that dream wasn't random. It was a warning, a sign. And if I was honest with myself, I knew that the dark path was the one I was already on. Not because it was explicitly evil, but because it was a path that led me away from the truth. A path where I followed rules, repeated prayers, but never truly knew the God I claimed to serve. It was in this state of spiritual turmoil that I began to delve even deeper into historical and comparative studies. I searched for the origins of Islamic rituals, especially those considered the most sacred. And what I found shook me deeply. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, has always been seen as the pinnacle of Islamic devotion. Circumventing the Kaaba 7 times was presented as an act of submission and love for Allah. But when I researched the origins of this ritual, I discovered something disturbing. Long before Islam, the people of pre-Islamic Arabia already performed this same act. At that time, the Kaaba was not a symbol of monotheism. It was a shrine filled with hundreds of idols representing different gods and tribal entities. Pilgrims circled that same stone cube in honor of these deities. When the Prophet Muhammad arose, the idols were destroyed, but the ritual remained. That bothered me like few things had before. If the physical gesture remains the same, but the target of worship changes, does that purify the act? Or could it be that, without realizing it, we still carry the essence of that pagan practice, simply dressed up in new words? What defines idolatry? Intention, action, or historical legacy? These questions began to erode everything I believed in, and with them came a fear I had never felt before. Not the fear of God's punishment, but the fear of living a lie disguised as faith. The emotional pain was intense. My heart felt like it was breaking every day, as if I were in mourning. And in a way, it was. I was burying the faith that had created me. I was saying goodbye to the comfort of the familiar. I was giving up an identity I'd fought my entire life to maintain. It wasn't just about leaving a religion. It was like losing a part of myself, like cutting ties with the only spiritual language my family understood. And the hardest part was knowing that following this new path inevitably meant losing people I loved. Because Islam isn't just a theological belief, it's a culture, a community, a network of relationships. And for many, questioning it is synonymous with betrayal, with apostasy, with shame. I knew there would be no going back. There would be no middle ground. But even so, something inside me screamed, the truth is worth more than anything, even if it costs me everything. And at that point in the journey, I was willing to lose everything, if it meant finally finding the true God, the God who requires no intermediaries, the God who doesn't hold me back out of fear, but draws me in through love. Realizing all of this wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like slowly waking from a long slumber, where reality slowly adjusts before my eyes. Realizing that I could no longer continue on the path of Islam felt like ripping my own skin, as if something deeply rooted within me was being ripped away. Not lightly, but painfully. I wasn't just questioning a religious system. I was challenging everything that had defined me since birth. My culture, my family, my name, everything seemed to be tied to this faith. And letting go of that meant relinquishing the identity I wore like a second skin, the kind you can't take off without leaving scars. More than that, it was like admitting that years of my life had been dedicated to something I now saw as fundamentally wrong. Not out of malice, but out of mistake. And that hurt. It hurt deeply. The guilt came like an avalanche, suffocating, relentless. How could I simply throw it all away? My parents, who raised me with such care, such sacrifice, who gave up comfort so I could be taught the principles of Islam. How would I look them in the eye? How could I explain that everything they believed they had done right, I now saw as distancing me from God, not bringing me closer? The anguish was unbearable. There were nights when I could barely breathe. I cried softly, huddled in my room, trying not to wake anyone. I struggled between the love I felt for my family and the undeniable need to be honest with myself, to follow what I now believed to be the truth. Each tear was a battle between loyalty to my past and the courage to embrace the future. I felt torn, shattered. It wasn't easy to love so much people who, no matter how much they loved me, might never understand me. And then came the isolation. The silence of those who once surrounded me spoke louder than any scream. When I began sharing my doubts, carefully, with thoughtful words, avoiding hurtful intent, the reactions were quick to follow. Invitations stopped coming. The calls ceased. Eyes averted when I entered a room, and little by little, I was pushed to the margin. I had relatives who began whispering behind my back, others who tried to spiritually rescue me, claiming I was possessed by evil influence. One even told me I was opening the gates of hell upon my life, and dragging my family down with me. Most told me to keep quiet, to keep my thoughts to myself. They said what I was doing was bringing shame to our name, to our history, to everything our ancestors fought to preserve. And hearing this, coming from the one I loved most, was like a blow to the chest. Not because they were harsh words, but because they came from hearts I considered unconditional allies. But even with all this suffering, there was something I could no longer deny. I could no longer pretend. Something inside me had awakened. And once your eyes are opened, you can no longer see things the same way. I wasn't being rebellious. I was being honest. For the first time in my life, I felt free. And, ironically, that freedom cost me everything. And looking back on it all now, with a little more clarity, I realized that this phase wasn't just about leaving a religion. It was about allowing myself to face truths that were buried under layers of tradition, fear, and conformity. It was like a deep cleansing of the soul, painful, exhausting, but absolutely necessary. Because true faith, I realized, cannot be built on a foundation of fear and obligation. It must be born from the search for truth, for real connection, for inner transformation. The decision to abandon Islam was neither impulsive nor sudden. It was the culmination of a long process, full of internal struggles, sleepless nights, silent prayers, and sincere tears. A process that began with doubt, moved through pain, and ended with something I never expected to find: peace. But before peace came confession. I clearly remember the day I told my parents. We were in the living room. The air felt heavier than ever. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint. I took a deep breath and said, almost whispering, "I can't believe it anymore. I can't keep pretending." The silence that followed seemed endless. My mother burst into tears. Her eyes were desperate. She begged me to reconsider. "You're being deceived. You're lost. Please, son, don't do this." My father didn't cry, but his gaze pierced me in a way that still pains me to remember. It was as if, in that moment, I had stopped being his son. He simply got up, went to his room, and locked the door. That day, I knew the bridges were starting to burn. The following days were like mourning. Some family members blocked me. Close friends disappeared. People who shared my childhood now pretended not to know me. I was excluded from groups, cut off from meetings, silenced on social media. It wasn't a violent rejection, but a slow and painful disconnection, like a thread that gradually frays until it snaps completely. And yet, I knew I had done what I needed to do. Because, for the first time, I wasn't trying to please anyone. I was trying to please God, the real God, the God who doesn't hide behind rituals, the God who doesn't demand fear, but offers grace, the God who doesn't get lost in intermediaries, but who revealed himself directly, clearly, personally, and transformatively. And I didn't know it yet. But this was the beginning of the greatest discovery of my life. Over time, even strangers I'd never met began to speak out against me. Offensive comments emerged out of nowhere, people calling me a traitor, an infidel, a servant of Satan. Many said I'd been deceived by the West, that I was selling out to the enemy's ideology, as if I were a puppet manipulated by dark forces. But what they didn't know, and perhaps never will, is that none of this was easy. None of my decisions were motivated by hatred or anger. It was, above all, a search for truth. And in this search, the cruel voices didn't silence me. They only revealed how precious inner silence was. It's strange to say, but in the midst of so much isolation, I began to feel a kind of freedom I'd never experienced before. For the first time, I wasn't living to please anyone. I was no longer guided by fear of judgment or the expectation of fitting in. I was just me, broken, confused, but finally honest with myself. Even so, the emotional toll was intense. There were days when loneliness crushed me. There were others when I felt like I was being reborn. To cope with all this, I decided to seek help. I began therapy, something I long considered unnecessary, or even a sign of weakness. But there, sitting in front of someone who listened to me without condemnation, I began to peel away layers of guilt, shame, and fear that had plagued me since childhood. Years of repression, of feelings swallowed in silence came to the surface. I discovered that much of my pain stemmed from never having the space to be vulnerable, to say, I don't know, I don't understand, or simply, I have doubts. I also began participating in small online groups, support spaces for people who, like me, were leaving Islam or experiencing a crisis of faith. There, for the first time, I found an echo of my own feelings. I heard stories as intense as my own. I discovered I was not alone. People from different countries, backgrounds, and contexts faced similar dilemmas. The fear of losing their families, the burden of apostasy, the search for meaning outside religious constraints, but the most profound turning point was spiritual. Because even after leaving Islam, I didn't lose my longing for God. I still believed there was something beyond us, something greater. I just didn't know what to call it anymore. It was at this point that Christianity began to enter my life, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not because it promised me paradise or ready-made answers. On the contrary, it was precisely because it didn't offer easy guarantees that it attracted me. The central message of Christianity, the idea that God loved me without me needing to deserve it, struck me like a thunderbolt. In Islam, I'd always felt like my salvation depended on my performance, that I had to prove myself every day, that any slip-up could cost me eternity. The idea of a God who grants grace, who offers forgiveness as a gift, not a reward, seemed absurd. And yet, it was exactly what my heart yearned to hear. Ephesians 2:8-9 became a key verse in this new phase. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. These words not only challenged my old understanding of God, they offered healing. For the first time, I didn't see myself trying to climb an impossible mountain to reach the divine. I was reached, right there, where I was, and that changed everything. Christianity didn't quench my thirst for justice or ethics, but it did so in a different way. In Islam, morality often resembled a scale, where every action was counted as a spiritual credit or debit. In Christianity, I discovered that morality was our response to God's love, and not an attempt to buy His favor. It was as if my life took on a new tone. I did good not out of fear of hell, but out of gratitude to the one who loved me first. And then came the teachings of Jesus. Love your enemy. Forgive 70 times 7. Turn the other cheek. Serve those who have nothing to give back. These words dismantled me. They were invitations to a new way of being, lighter, deeper, freer. The kind of life that isn't measured by external rules, but by an internal transformation that begins in the heart and overflows into the world. Even the doctrine of judgment, which had previously terrified me, took on a new face. In Islam, hell seemed the inevitable fate for those who did not submit to the Islamic faith. But in Christianity, I came across passages like 1 Timothy 2:4. God desires all men to be saved and to come to the full knowledge of the truth. This thought gave me hope. God wasn't a distant judge waiting for a mistake to condemn. He was a father who sought out his children with persistent love. Of course, my search wasn't limited to Christianity. I was curious about various beliefs. Atheism appealed to me for a time. The freedom to reject all things spiritual seemed like a relief. No dogma, no fear. But the deeper I delved into it, the more I felt a cold emptiness, a lack of purpose. The universe without God seemed ordered but devoid of meaning. Judaism also caught my attention, especially for the richness of its tradition and community. But the idea of the exclusivity of the covenant, of a people chosen by birth, turned me off. Buddhism, in turn, offered me valuable advice on suffering and mindfulness. I learned a lot about balance and awareness, but something essential was missing there. An intimate connection with a personal God who knew me by name and walked with me. And that's exactly what I found in Christ. A God who not only created the world, but who entered it, suffered in it, and gave himself up for love of us. And more than that, a God who called me closer, not because I deserved it, but because of grace. Over time, I realized that my faith journey wasn't a straight line, much less a path that was the same for everyone. It was a constant process of trial and error, where what made sense to others didn't necessarily work for me. and vice versa. Something that really struck me and that marked a profound contrast between my former life in Islam and my new beliefs was the almost complete absence of fear. In Islam, the fear of eternal fire, of torment in hell, was a constant shadow that hung over all my spiritual actions. I prayed, fasted, and gave charity, but with each act came that crushing anxiety. Would this be enough to save my soul? Would one failure condemn me? This pressure was suffocating, a burden too heavy to bear day after day. But as I approached Christianity, I encountered a message that seemed otherworldly, a message of absolute freedom. I clearly remember the impact Romans 8:1 had on me. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus. Those 6 simple words sounded like chains breaking inside my heart. No more condemnation. No more a relentless judge watching my every mistake. No more paralyzing fear keeping me trapped in the past. This realization completely transformed my view of morality. It was no longer about following rules to avoid punishment or striving to earn God's favor out of obligation. I began to understand that I could act well simply because I wanted to repay the immense love I had freely received. This shift gave my faith a new lightness, a new meaning. I also discovered biblical parallels that helped me visualize God in a more personal and intimate way. In Islam, God often seemed like a distant authority, a sovereign and unattainable force. In Psalm 23, God is described as a shepherd who lovingly cares for his sheep, guiding, protecting, and comforting them. This imagery touched my heart deeply. John 10:10, with its promise of abundant life, made me question whether spiritual life should be a mere survival awaiting judgment or a journey filled with meaning, joy, and hope. That's when I began to rethink everything I knew about God. Is he truly a harsh judge waiting for the right moment to punish? Or is he a loving father, eager to restore, welcome, and transform? Does he care more about repentant hearts than about perfect rituals? As this newfound faith took hold, I could feel changes taking place within me. The consuming fear gave way to vibrant hope. Constant guilt was replaced by genuine gratitude. Isolation, though still present, began to be filled with a sense of connection, not only with others who shared my journey, but with something greater, eternal, and good. Leaving Islam didn't mean I had abandoned my faith in God. On the contrary, it was a door that opened to a richer, deeper, more nuanced spirituality I had never experienced before. Today, when I pray, it's not out of obligation or fear of punishment. It's out of gratitude, joy, and a sincere desire to draw closer to the one who loved me first. But not everything was smooth sailing on this journey. The scars of the past still haunt me, reminding me daily of the battles I faced. The greatest of these, without a doubt, was the loss of my family. Because when I decided to tell my parents about my decision to abandon Islam, their reaction was devastating. My mother couldn't hold back her tears. Between sobs, she clutched her rosary so tightly it seemed she believed it could protect her from this inexplicable pain. "How could you do this to us?" she asked, her voice cracking with tears, each word weighed like a blade. My father, for his part, was silent for what seemed like an eternity. His eyes were fixed on me, but it was as if he were looking right through me, a look filled with anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. When he finally spoke, his words were harsh and clear, cutting deep into my heart. "If you leave Islam, you are leaving this family." At that moment, I thought it was just a threat meant to scare me, to make me back down, to make me lie again and hide my thoughts. But as the days, weeks, and months passed, I realized it wasn't a threat. It was cruel reality. They began to drift apart. The calls that once filled my phone became rare, then disappeared. Birthdays passed, as did parties and celebrations, without an invitation, without a message. Major holidays were spent in solitude. As I watched my old life slip away like sand through my fingers, it was a loss I hadn't expected, but it showed me the price of truth and the value of freedom. Because even in the face of pain, I knew I could no longer live a lie. The truth I had found set me free, even if it cost me everything. For all intents and purposes, I had been rejected. It wasn't just a passing feeling, It was a stark reality that manifested itself with every missed call, every ignored message. My siblings, who had once been companions and confidants, also distanced themselves. At first, some tried to talk, even argue with me, urging me to keep my doubts to myself, to pretend to believe for the sake of family peace. Just pretend, for everyone's sake, they said. But as soon as it became clear that I wouldn't back down, that I wouldn't hide my truth, they too distanced themselves. One of my sisters even unfollowed me on social media, severing the small bond we still had. Another sister, perhaps the most painful, refused to let me see her children, claiming she didn't want me to influence. This decision cut me deeply. I felt the weight of the cultural stigma surrounding apostasy, so intense that not even the blood ties, which I had thought were unbreakable, were enough to withstand it. What truly hurt wasn't just the rejection, which was devastating in itself, but the awareness of how deeply rooted shame and honor were in that culture. To them, I wasn't just a daughter or sister who had changed her mind. I was tarnishing the family name, dishonoring generations of Muslims who had lived before me, a stain that threatened to erase the respect I had so hard-earned. The weight of this accusation was like a stone on my chest, and some days it felt almost impossible to breathe or so much suffering. But it wasn't just within my family that the storm brewed. The reaction from the Muslim community around me was equally harsh. Friends who, until recently, had shared dinners, late-night laughs, advice, and confidences with me, suddenly began treating me as if I were a stranger, or worse, an enemy to be avoided. Aggressive and cold messages flooded my inbox. Accusations of brainwashing, of being under the influence of perverse Western ideology, or simply of being a bad and deceived person. Harsh and offensive words, which I would never repeat, echoed in my ear. Some went further, reporting my apostasy to local mosque leaders, which led to anonymous sermons where apostates were harshly condemned from the pulpit. I began to notice the fear in people's eyes when they saw me, the same fear I felt every time someone dared question religious authority. It was a silent, palpable fear that made me feel invisible, unwanted, even threatened. The feeling of isolation grew, suffocating. For a time, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake in seeking truth. Would living authentically really be worth it if I lost everything and everyone I knew and loved? My thoughts revolved around this question as I struggled to make sense of my new identity, which now bore the label of ex-Muslim, an identity that seemed to have no place anywhere in the world. Every simple social interaction, like introducing myself to someone new, became a situation fraught with anxiety and insecurity. Should I reveal my origins? Should I hide this part of myself to avoid judgment? How could I explain the absence of my family without seeming bitter or hurt? These questions gnawed at my mind, making even the most ordinary moments tense. There were days when I felt an almost desperate urge to go back, not necessarily to reconcile with Islam itself, but to reclaim the simplicity of knowing who I was, of having a defined place in the world and in my family. I wanted the comfort of a clear identity, even if it came with rules and limitations. But instead, I chose to piece together the fragments of what was left of me and build something new, an identity that honored my past, my values, and my roots, but also embraced the freedom I felt in my present. It wasn't an easy or quick process. There were days when the loneliness felt overwhelming, almost unbearable. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Yet, step by step, slowly, I began to rebuild myself. Amidst all the pain, rejection, and doubt, there were also moments of triumph. Small victories, a sincere conversation with someone who didn't judge me, a prayer that filled me with peace, a book that brought me comfort. These little lights along the way reminded me why I had chosen this journey. I was finding myself again, discovering that the freedom to live my truth comes at a cost, yes, but it also brings a strength I never imagined I possessed. And despite everything, this search for authenticity was worth every tear, every moment of silence, and every fear faced. One of the most remarkable and transformative experiences I had after leaving Islam was, without a doubt, finding acceptance in a new community. At first, I confess, I felt an enormous fear of never belonging anywhere again. I carried with me the feeling of having been expelled from an entire world, my family, my friends, my culture, and my faith. I felt lost in a void, a rootless stranger. But then, almost by chance, I stumbled upon a group of ex-Muslims who, like me, were going through this difficult transition. We met regularly for meetings where, for the first time in a long time, I could be completely honest about my doubts, my pain, and my dreams. There were no masks, no judgment, or condemnations, just people who understood exactly what I was going through because they were living the same reality. There, in that welcoming space, our stories intertwined, and the words of support and encouragement strengthened us. It was like finding a safe harbor after an endless storm. These connections were true anchors, pulling me out of the darkness when I thought I might drown in a sea of loneliness and despair. The feeling of being seen, heard, and understood filled me with a hope I hadn't felt in years. It was no longer a feeling of being merely tolerated or endured, but of being genuinely accepted for who I truly was, a woman who had made difficult choices, but who sought to live with integrity and authenticity. Furthermore, building relationships outside my old circles was an unexpected source of joy and growth. Unfettered by cultural or religious expectations, I was finally able to experience friendships based on genuine respect and the freedom to be myself. In these new relationships, no one expected me to fulfill rigid roles, nor pressured me to conform to traditions I no longer believed in. People simply cared about me as a person, regardless of my beliefs or lack thereof. This transformation even extended to the realm of romantic relationships. Previously, I felt enormous pressure to marry someone who shared my faith and fit the ideals of my family and community. It was a choice fraught with obligations and expectations, not necessarily genuine love. But by breaking free from these constraints, I learned that true love can exist far beyond the boundaries of religion. I began to see the possibility of relationships built on respect, understanding, and mutual freedom, without faith being a mandatory condition for loving or being loved. Looking back today, I see how much I've grown and evolved along this journey. Although the scars of rejection and pain are still present, they no longer define me as symbols of failure or defeat. Instead, they've become powerful reminders of my resilience and my ability to overcome adversity. Each new relationship I've built, each person who's entered my life since leaving Islam, has taught me something profound about trust, vulnerability, and the value of authenticity. I know I may never fully reconcile with my family, and I may never regain the affection or approval of those who once loved me. But I've learned to accept this loss with a calmer heart, because I've understood that by giving up what I thought I needed to be happy, I've found something infinitely more precious: the freedom to live my life on my own terms, with purpose, connection, and hope. Leaving Islam was not an act of gratuitous rebellion, nor a simple rejection. It was a profound journey toward true freedom, the kind that frees us from the invisible chains of fear, guilt, and social pressure. For a long time, I carried the crushing weight of expectations from my family, my community, and even the very idea of God that I was taught to fear. But when I finally walked away from all of that, an incredible transformation took place within me. I began to feel lighter, not just spiritually, but mentally and emotionally. The constant fear of judgment, the guilt over every mistake, the desperate need to be perfect and never fail, all of this began to dissipate. In place of these anxieties, I found clarity, peace, and a profound sense of relief. I understood that true faith, the kind that truly transforms, should not imprison but liberate. For the first time, I felt free to think, question, and explore the world and spirituality without having to apologize or hide. This freedom redefined everything: the way I see myself, the way I see the world, and the relationships I build. If you, listening or reading this, are facing a similar struggle in your own faith journey, I want you to know one fundamental thing: you are not alone. Millions of people around the world are experiencing similar doubts, fears, questions, and pain. And even if the path seems lonely and daunting, There is hope, there is support, and there is light. Even in the most difficult moment, never lose faith that you deserve to live an authentic, fulfilling, and meaningful life. Some remain silent for fear of repercussions. Others depart silently, disappearing into new lives they never imagined possible. Whatever path you choose, know this: you deserve to live authentically. Your beliefs, your doubts, your search for truth, they matter. Don't let anyone shame you, force you to remain silent, or force you to fit into a box that doesn't fit who you are. Critical thinking is a gift. Asking questions isn't a betrayal of faith, it's an act of courage. So wherever you are on your journey, keep going. Even if it feels like you're walking through fire, trust that healing and hope await on the other side. I know that not everyone will agree with my interpretation of Islam or my decision to abandon it, and that's okay. Faith is deeply personal, and everyone's experience is unique. Some of you may be inspired by what I've shared. Others may vehemently disagree, and that's okay too. My goal isn't to convince anyone to follow in my footsteps. Above all, I want to emphasize the importance of individual choice and critical thinking. If your faith brings you joy, purpose, and fulfillment, hold on to it firmly. But if it leaves you stuck, conflicted, or empty, don't be afraid to question. Life is too short to live someone else's truth. You owe it to yourself to find what works for you, even if it means forging a completely new path. If my story resonates with you, if it brings you hope or makes you feel less alone, I'd be honored if you'd share this video. Conversations about faith, doubt, and freedom are sorely needed in today's world. We often avoid these topics because they make us uncomfortable, but it's precisely in discomfort that growth happens. Let's create spaces where people can ask difficult questions without fear of judgment. If you feel inspired to get involved, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, and join the discussion below. Share your thoughts, your struggles, your triumphs, because together we can build a community rooted in empathy and understanding. Always remember to approach each other with kindness and respect. Disagreements are inevitable, but hostility doesn't have to be. Before I close, I want to thank you for listening, for being open-minded, and allowing me to share my story. It means more to me than words can express. Remember, no matter where you are on your journey, there is always hope for change and healing. Whether you're doubting your faith, rebuilding it after leaving it, or simply trying to discover who you are, take heart. You are stronger than you imagine, braver than you feel, and capable of creating a true life for yourself. Keep fighting for your truth, even when it seems impossible. The path ahead may not be easy, but I promise it's worth it.